The crown was supposed to rest on her head, not on a velvet cushion atop a closed, empty casket. Princess Amelia was dead, reduced to ash on a desolate alien battlefield. Her empire wept. But the universe has a funny way of resurrecting ghosts when a human gets involved. The sky over New Avalon wept a steady, miserable gray rain, as if the planet itself understood the magnitude of the loss. In the grand courtyard of the royal palace, 10,000 elite soldiers stood in perfect, rigid formation. The water cascaded off their polished black composite armor, yet not a single man or woman moved. They were the Iron Vanguard, the pride of the human coalition on Kepler, 186F, and they were burying their future. King Robert Rutherford stood at the podium, his face a mask of carved granite, though his eyes betrayed the hollow, shattered soul beneath. He gripped the edges of the marble stand so tightly his knuckles were white. Beneath him, resting on a catafalque draped in the cobalt and gold banner of House Rutherford, was a casket. It was empty. Princess Amelia Rutherford, the heir apparent, the coalition's most brilliant tactical mind, and Robert's only daughter, had fallen 3 weeks ago at the Battle of Obsidian Ridge. The Viren, a highly advanced, ruthlessly bureaucratic alien species that had been systematically pushing humanity out of the sector, had ambushed her command ship. The official report stated that her vessel, the Dauntless, was caught in a localized plasma bombardment. The heat had been so intense that the hull had simply vaporized. There was nothing left to recover. "She was the best of us," King Robert began, his voice amplified by the courtyard's acoustics, echoing heavily through the rain. Amelia did not just fight for the crown. She fought for the right of every human to exist in a galaxy that has repeatedly told us we do not belong. She believed in our endurance. She believed in... His voice cracked. He swallowed hard, staring at the empty wooden box. Standing a few paces behind the king, General Thomas Wright adjusted his collar. Wright was a decorated veteran, a man whose face was marred by the scars of a dozen campaigns. Beside him stood Commander Abigail Hayes, the head of Royal Intelligence, her expression unreadable. "We must stay strong, Your Majesty," General Wright whispered, stepping forward to offer a steadying hand. "The people are looking to you. We must project strength, or the Viren will exploit our grief." Robert nodded slowly, gathering himself to resume the eulogy. But before he could speak another word, the low, mournful silence of the funeral was shattered by a sound that tore through the atmosphere, a high-pitched, agonizing screech of tearing metal and failing atmospheric thrusters. Every soldier in the courtyard instinctively reached for their weapons. The anti-air sirens began to wail, a deafening klaxon that drowned out the drumming rain. "Incoming!" Commander Hayes barked into her comms unit. "Identify target! Why didn't radar pick this up?" "Ma'am, It has no active transponder," a panicked voice replied over the comms. "It's dropping out of the cloud cover right above the palace. Trajectory is. It's coming down in the courtyard." Robert looked up. Breaking through the dense gray clouds was a ship, but ship was a generous term. It was a battered, heavily modified light freighter, its hull scorched black and gray, with mismatched plating that looked like it had been welded on by a blind mechanic. One of its primary engines was on fire, trailing thick black smoke, and its landing gear was only half deployed. It was an ugly, brutalist piece of machinery, a far cry from the sleek, aerodynamic vessels of the Royal Navy. "Protect the king!" General Wright roared, drawing his sidearm. The Royal Guard swarmed Robert, forming a protective shield of energy barriers and armored bodies, dragging him back toward the palace doors. With a deafening crunch, the crippled freighter slammed into the pristine marble of the courtyard, skidding across the rain-slick stone, tearing up statues and ceremonial braziers. It finally ground to a halt mere yards from the empty casket, hissing steam and venting coolant into the chilly air. The side of the hull read in faded, hand-painted letters, "The Rusty Nail." For a long, tense moment, the only sound was the popping of hot metal cooling in the rain. Thousands of pulse rifles were trained on the boarding ramp. "Hold your fire," General Wright commanded, his eyes narrowed. "Wait for movement." The hydraulic locks on the ship's side door engaged with a heavy clack. The ramp slowly descended, slamming into the cracked marble. Through the smoke and venting steam, a silhouette emerged. It wasn't a Verne strike team. It was a single human man. He looked like he had been chewed up and spat out by a black hole. He wore heavy, scavenged tactical gear, the kind favored by deep space mercenaries and fringe prospectors. His armor was gouged and covered in dried, reddish-brown mud. A heavy kinetic revolver was strapped to his thigh, and his face was obscured by a heavy breather mask and a ragged hood. But it wasn't the man's appearance that caused the collective breath of the courtyard to catch. It was what he was dragging behind him. Strapped to an anti-gravity sled, hovering inches above the ground, was a military-grade medical stasis pod. The glass was frosted over, illuminated by a faint, blinking green light indicating active life support. The stranger slowly raised his hands, showing he was holding no weapons. He reached up, pulled back his hood, and unlatched his breather mask. He was young, perhaps in his early 30s, with a day's worth of dark stubble, exhausted brown eyes, and a fresh cut bleeding down the side of his jaw. "I'm looking for the guy in charge," the stranger called out, his voice hoarse but surprisingly steady given the thousands of guns pointed at his chest. General Wright stepped out from behind the energy shields, his weapon aimed squarely at the man's head. "Identify yourself immediately. You have violated restricted airspace and interrupted a royal state funeral. Give me one reason I shouldn't have you vaporized where you stand." The man coughed, wiping rain and soot from his face. "Name's Harrison Mitchell. Friends call me Harry. And as for the reason..." Harry turned, grabbed the heavy release handle of the stasis pod, and wiped away the condensation on the reinforced glass. "You guys might want to hold off on the funeral," Harry said, his voice carrying over the silent, stunned crowd. "The guest of honor ain't dead yet." King Robert pushed past his guards, ignoring their frantic protests. He sprinted through the rain, falling to his knees beside the hovering pod. He pressed his trembling hands against the cold glass. Lying inside, battered, bruised, and hooked up to a dozen improvised IV lines and a jury-rigged rebreather, was Princess Amelia. Her chest rose and fell in a slow, shallow rhythm. She was alive. The medical wing of the royal palace was a flurry of chaotic, controlled panic. Dr. Richard Lewis, the chief medical officer, shouted orders as a team of trauma surgeons wheeled Amelia's stasis pod into the intensive care unit. The royal family's private wing had been instantly locked down by the vanguard. In the adjoining observation room, Harrison Mitchell sat on a sleek, uncomfortable titanium bench. He looked wildly out of place in the sterile, pristine environment. He was currently peeling a strip of duct tape off his left gauntlet, seemingly unbothered by the fact that he was surrounded by 4 heavily armed guards and being glared at by General Wright and Commander Hayes. King Robert stood by the observation glass, watching the medical team frantically stabilize his daughter. He finally turned, his eyes locking onto Harrison. The grief in the king's face had been replaced by a fierce, desperate intensity. "Who are you?" Robert demanded, his voice low and dangerous. "And how do you have my daughter?" Harry sighed, tossing the wad of duct tape onto a pristine medical tray. "Like I told your angry friend outside, Your Majesty, I'm Harrison. I'm a scavenger, a scrapper. I make my living picking through the debris fields on the outer fringes. Vern scrap, coalition scrap, doesn't matter to me. It pays the bills." "A vulture," Commander Hayes spat, her arms crossed. "A recycling enthusiast," Harry corrected with a smirk, though it faded quickly. "Look, 3 weeks ago, I was operating near the ash wastes in Sector 4, the Obsidian Ridge. That sector was completely irradiated," General Wright interrupted, stepping forward. "The Viren saturation bombardment melted the bedrock. Nothing could have survived that. Our search and rescue drones couldn't even penetrate the interference." "Your drones are too fancy," Harry said, leaning back. "They rely on quantum-entangled signals and clean atmospheric data. I fly a rust bucket that runs on analog fuel injectors and spite. The Vern didn't detect me because my ship's energy signature is so low, it registers as background radiation." Harry leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, the memory darkening his eyes. "I waited until the Viren dreadnoughts moved on. I went down into the wastes, looking for salvage. That's when I picked up a faint SOS, not a digital ping, an old-school shortwave radio click, Morse code." Robert stared at him. "Amelia." "She's smart, your girl," Harry nodded. "I tracked the signal. The Royal Command ship wasn't vaporized, like your reports probably said. It was shot down. It crashed hard into the canyons of the ridge. When I found it, the hull was split open. The Viren hunting packs were already sniffing around the wreckage. Commander Hayes narrowed her eyes. Are you expecting us to believe that you, a single scavenger, fought off a Vern hunting pack? Harry let out a dry, humorless laugh. Fight them? Hell no. Vern hunters are 8 feet of armored scales and plasma rifles. I'm a guy from New Detroit with a bad knee. No, I didn't fight them. I outsmarted them. It's the human specialty, isn't it? Harry explained how he had slathered himself and the princess in heavily irradiated mud from the canyon floor to mask their thermal signatures. He found Amelia pinned beneath a collapsed bulkhead in the ship's medbay. She was bleeding out, her royal armor shredded. She was barely conscious, Harry said quietly, looking at the floor. She had a collapsed lung, internal bleeding, and plasma burns. The Vyrn were sweeping the canyon with bioscanners. So, I took an old Vyrn power cell I scavenged, wired it to a human-made defibrillator, and essentially created a localized EMP loop. It scrambled their scanners just long enough for me to drag her onto my sled. That shouldn't be possible, Dr. Lewis said, stepping out of the operating theater. He wiped sweat from his brow, looking at Harry with a mixture of disbelief and awe. The voltage alone should have killed you both. The improvised life support system you hooked her up to in that stasis pod. It's a nightmare of crossed wires and bypasses. You used industrial coolant to regulate her body temperature. If it looks stupid but it works, it ain't stupid, Doc, Harry shrugged. I had to keep her stabilized while I sneaked past the Vyrn blockade. It took me 3 weeks of hopping between asteroid belts and running dark to get back to New Avalon. We ran out of standard medical supplies on day 4. I've been using scavenged med gel and adrenaline to keep her heart beating. Robert walked slowly over to Harry. The king, a man who commanded billions, looked down at the dirty, exhausted scavenger. Slowly, Robert extended his hand. You saved her, Robert said, his voice thick with emotion. You risked your life, a civilian, to bring my daughter home. The coalition owes you a debt that cannot be measured. Harry looked at the king's hand, then slowly shook it. Don't thank me yet, Your Majesty. There's something else. The room went completely still. When I pulled her out of the wreckage, Harry said, his tone dropping an octave, losing all its casual sarcasm, she was lucid for about 2 minutes before the pain put her under. She grabbed my collar, pulled me close, and told me to remember something. What did she say? General Wright asked, his hand instinctively resting on his sidearm. She said to tell the king Harry locked eyes with Robert. She said, the shields didn't fail. They were turned off. The silence that followed was suffocating. Commander Hayes was the first to speak. That's impossible. The Dauntless had state-of-the-art encryption. The only way the shields could be disabled is from the inside, King Robert finished, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. The blood drained from his face as he looked at the high-ranking officers in the room. Someone in high command gave the Vyrn her shield frequencies. Someone wanted her dead. Harry slowly stood up, subtly shifting his weight, so his hand rested near the grip of his kinetic revolver. Yeah. And seeing as I just brought the only witness back to life and landed her right in the middle of your heavily guarded palace, I'm guessing whoever ordered the hit is probably panicking right about now. Secure the perimeter! General Wright roared, his face flushing crimson. He tapped his earpiece furiously. Vanguard Actual, this is General Wright. Initiate Code Black. Seal the medical wing. No one gets in or out without my direct authorization. Hold your orders, General, Commander Hayes countered, stepping between Wright and the door. If there is a traitor in the High Command, locking us in a box with the princess makes us sitting ducks. We need to move her to the secure bunker beneath the palace. She's in critical condition, Abigail. Moving her will kill her, Dr. Lewis protested, moving to block the door to the ICU. Harry watched the elite officers bicker, his survival instincts screaming at him. He had spent his life on the fringes of human space, where trust was a currency you couldn't afford to spend blindly. He looked at the heavy blast doors of the medical wing, then at the ventilation grates. Your Majesty, Harry said quietly, stepping close to Robert, you need to pull your sidearm, and you need to trust absolutely no one in this room. Robert looked at him, startled, but the king was no fool. He had survived decades of political maneuvering. He discreetly unholstered his compact energy pistol, keeping it hidden by his side. Inside the glass-walled ICU, Amelia stirred. The biomonitors attached to her began to beep with an elevated heart rate. Dr. Lewis rushed inside. She's waking up. The adrenaline cocktail is wearing off, but her consciousness is surfacing. Robert pushed past Wright and Hayes, rushing into the room. Harry followed closely behind, his eyes scanning every shadow, every guard stationed in the hallway outside the glass. Amelia's eyes fluttered open. They were bloodshot, and she looked frail, but the sheer, indomitable willpower of the Princess of New Avalon burned fiercely in her gaze. She looked at her father, a weak, relieved smile touching her cracked lips. "Dad," she whispered, her voice like grinding sand. "I'm here, Amelia. I'm right here," Robert said, tears finally breaking, spilling down his cheeks as he gripped her hand. "You're safe." Amelia's eyes shifted, looking past her father. She saw General Wright, Commander Hayes, and then she saw Harry. Recognition flashed in her eyes. The scrapper. "Told you I'd get you home, Princess," Harry said, offering a tight smile. Amelia squeezed her father's hand with sudden, frantic strength. "Father, the battle. We were outflanked. They knew our exact coordinates. They knew where the fleet would jump out of hyperspace." "We know, sweetheart," Robert said softly. "Mr. Mitchell told us about the shields. We will find the traitor, I promise you." "No," Amelia gasped, struggling to sit up, her biomonitors flashing yellow warnings. "You don't understand. It wasn't just the shields. The override code. I saw it on the command console before the bridge was hit. It was a Royal Sigma-level clearance code. There are only 3 people who have that code." Harry did the math in his head instantly. The king, the princess. Amelia locked eyes with the man standing outside the glass room. And General Wright, everything happened in a fraction of a second. Harry didn't wait for the general to explain himself. He had lived this long by reacting faster than the other guy. As General Wright's hand moved toward his sidearm, Harry tackled King Robert to the ground. A high-powered plasma bolt shattered the reinforced glass of the ICU, incinerating the spot where the king had been standing a millisecond prior. "Kill them all!" General Wright bellowed into his comms. "The king has been compromised by a Viren infiltrator. Execute Protocol Omega." The 4 royal guards in the observation room, handpicked by Wright, instantly raised their rifles. Commander Hayes drew her weapon, but before she could aim, one of the guards shot her in the shoulder, sending her spinning to the floor in a spray of blood. "Get down!" Harry yelled. He grabbed a heavy, compressed oxygen tank from a medical cart. With a fluid, practiced motion, he slammed the valve against the sharp edge of the bed frame, shearing the metal off. He hurled the hissing, highly pressurized tank through the shattered glass into the observation room. "Grenade!" one of the traitorous guards yelled. Harry drew his kinetic revolver, a massive, ugly hand cannon that fired solid, depleted uranium slugs and shot the airborne oxygen tank. The explosion was deafening. The concussive wave blew the remaining glass inward and sent the 4 guards flying backward, their armor sparking. General Wright, shielded by a personal energy barrier, stumbled back but remained on his feet. He aimed his plasma pistol at Amelia's bed. Before he could pull the trigger, a loud Z, 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 A, Ep, echoed through the room. Dr. Lewis, the middle-aged, mild-mannered chief medical officer, had grabbed 2 high-voltage defibrillator paddles. He lunged forward and jammed them directly into the side of General Wright's neck, bypassing his energy shield entirely. Wright convulsed violently, his eyes rolling back into his head and collapsed to the floor, smoking slightly. "Hippocratic oath," Dr. Lewis panted, dropping the paddles, his hands shaking violently. "Do no harm, unless they're shooting up my ICU." Harry scrambled to his feet, kicking the plasma rifles away from the stunned guards and keeping his revolver trained on the hallway door. "Nice work, Doc, but we ain't out of the woods yet." The lights in the medical wing suddenly flickered and died. The hum of the palace's primary generator faded, replaced instantly by the low red glow of emergency backup lighting. The biomonitors switched to internal batteries, emitting a steady, eerie chime in the crimson dark. Heavy, synchronized footsteps echoed down the hallway outside. Dozens of them. "Wright just triggered Protocol Omega," King Robert said, helping Commander Hayes up and applying pressure to her bleeding shoulder. The king's face was pale, realizing the sheer scale of the betrayal. "That's a total military coup lockdown." The Vanguard, outside. They answer to right. They're coming to finish the job, Amelia said, struggling to pull an IV out of her arm. Father, you have to leave me. Get to the bunker. I am not leaving you again, Amelia, Robert snapped, his royal authority returning with a vengeance. Harry moved to the heavy security doors of the medical wing and manually slammed the mechanical lockdown bar into place, just as the first plasma bolts began to melt the outside of the door. "They're cutting through!" Harry yelled over the noise. He looked around the room. 3 wounded people, a doctor, and a princess who could barely stand. They had no heavy weapons, no armor, and a battalion of elite soldiers trying to murder them. It was exactly the kind of impossible, back-against-the-wall scenario humanity had built its reputation on. Harry grinned, a feral, wild look in his eyes. He looked at the medical equipment, the explosive chemical compounds in the drug cabinets, and the high-voltage power lines running through the walls. "All right, Your Majesty," Harry said, cracking his knuckles. "You hired a scavenger. Let me show you how we scrap on the fringes. Doc, grab all the pure ethanol and medgel you have. We're about to make some very unroyal explosives." The heavy Durasteel doors of the medical wing began to glow a violent, angry orange. The Vanguard soldiers outside were using thermal breaching lances, melting through the reinforced locking mechanisms with terrifying efficiency. The air inside the ICU grew stiflingly hot, smelling of burnt ozone and melting polymers. "They'll be through in less than 2 minutes. Commander Abigail Hayes gritted her teeth, clutching her wounded shoulder as King Robert tightly bound it with a pressure bandage. Standard Vanguard breach protocol. 2 heavy shield bearers in the front, followed by a sweep of localized stun grenades, then pulse rifle suppression. We won't even see them before we're blind and riddled with holes. Standard protocol relies on predictability, Harrison Mitchell muttered, frantically tearing open medical supply cabinets. He tossed armfuls of high-grade synthetic med gel onto the floor. "Doc, I need that ethanol. All of it." Dr. Richard Lewis, still trembling slightly from having just electrocuted a 4-star general, sprinted out of the supply closet carrying 4 large glass jugs of pure medical-grade sterilization alcohol. "What exactly is the chemical application here, Mr. Mitchell?" "We are making hillbilly napalm, Doc," Harry said, snatching the jugs. He shattered them against the heavy metal gurneys he had kicked over to form a barricade facing the door. The volatile liquid pooled across the slick tiles, mixing with the thick, sticky medgel. The gel acts as a binding agent. It'll stick to their armor and burn at around 3,000 degrees. Energy shields block high-velocity kinetic rounds and plasma bursts. They don't block liquid fire. Amelia, pale and shivering, forced herself to sit upright on the edge of her biobed. She yanked the final IV line from her hand, ignoring the monitors screaming in protest. "Harry, you need an ignition source that won't give our position away." "Way ahead of you, princess," Harry replied, stripping the heavy insulated wiring from a portable MRI machine. He jury-rigged the wires to the discarded defibrillator paddles, running the exposed copper ends directly into the puddle of ethanol and gel. "When that door drops, they're going to rush the gap. Doc, when I say hit it, you crank that machine to maximum output." King Robert stepped forward, his royal finery ruined, stained with sweat, blood, and soot. He held his compact energy pistol with a steady, practiced grip. "Abigail, take Amelia into the sterilization chamber in the back. The walls are lead-lined. It might offer some cover." "I am not hiding, Father," Amelia said, her voice raspy but coated in iron. She reached down to a fallen, traitorous guard and hoisted his heavy plasma rifle into her lap. "I am the commander of the Coalition Armed Forces. If I am to die in this room, I will die with a weapon in my hands." Robert looked at his daughter, his chest tight with a mixture of agonizing fear and boundless pride. He simply nodded, taking his position behind a reinforced surgical table beside Harry. "Hiss! Clang!" The heavy mechanical lock gave way. The center of the blast doors caved inward as a heavy kinetic ram smashed through the melted slag. Through the smoke, the towering silhouettes of the Vanguard breach team emerged, their heavy energy shields overlapping like a Roman testudo. "Flash out!" a muffled voice yelled from the corridor. 2 cylindrical grenades bounced into the room. "Eyes down!" Harry roared. The room erupted in blinding white light and a concussive crack that rattled the teeth in their skulls. But before the Vanguard soldiers could capitalize on the stun, Harry yelled over the ringing in his ears. "Now, Doc, light 'em up." Dr. Lewis slammed the defibrillator activation switch. A massive arc of blue electricity shot down the exposed copper wires, sparking violently as it hit the puddle of chemical slurry. The reaction was instantaneous. The floor transformed into a roaring inferno. The chemical fire surged forward, splashing over the boots and shins of the advancing vanguard. Just as Harry had predicted, their state-of-the-art kinetic barriers were designed to stop fast-moving projectiles, not a creeping liquid wave of fire. The sticky, burning gel clung to their composite armor, superheating the environmental seals. The front line of elite soldiers broke formation, screaming as they frantically tried to pat out the flames, their heavy shields dropping to the floor. "Fire!" Robert commanded. The king fired his pistol with lethal precision, catching the exposed guards in the gaps of their armor. Amelia, leaning heavily against a diagnostic machine, laid down a withering volley of plasma fire, her tactical brilliance showing even in her weakened state as she targeted the bottleneck of the doorway, preventing any reinforcements from pushing through. Harry didn't use plasma. He stepped out from behind the barricade, raised his heavy kinetic revolver, and pulled the trigger. The weapon roared like a caged beast. The depleted uranium slug shattered the chest plate of the lead Vanguard captain, throwing the heavily armored man backward into his own squad. "Push up! Push up!" Harry shouted, grabbing Amelia by the tactical harness of the guard she had stripped. "We can't hold this room! They'll just pump the ventilation with nerve gas! We have to move!" "The maintenance shafts!" Commander Hayes yelled over the gunfire, firing her sidearm with her good arm. "Behind the hydro tanks!" "It leads down to the palace catacombs. We can reach the hangar bay from there." "Go! I'll cover the rear!" Robert shouted. Dr. Lewis practically carried Amelia toward the back of the ward, shoving the heavy hydro tanks aside to reveal a narrow, grated access panel. Harry blasted the lock off with his revolver and kicked the grate in. As they funneled into the dark, cramped shaft, a new sound echoed from the corridor, a sound that made Amelia's blood run cold. It was a heavy, rhythmic thudding, accompanied by a low, guttural clicking sound that vibrated in the chest. "Vern," Amelia whispered, her eyes wide. "They're inside the palace." Harry dragged King Robert into the shaft just as the main doors were blown completely off their hinges. Standing in the smoke, stepping over the burning bodies of the vanguard, were 3 Viren shock troopers. They were massive, bipedal monstrosities, covered in obsidian scales, wielding heavy disruptor cannons that glowed with sickly purple energy. Wright didn't just sell me out, Amelia realized, the horrific truth dawning on her as they scrambled down the dusty, pitch-black maintenance shaft. He sold the entire planet. The descent through the palace catacombs was a grueling, agonizing journey. The air grew cold and damp, smelling of ancient stone and engine grease. Above them, the palace was a war zone. The muffled concussions of heavy ordnance shook dust from the ceiling, indicating that the loyalist factions of the Royal Guard were violently clashing with Wright's corrupted vanguard and their Viren masters. Wright couldn't have brought a Viren invasion force past the orbital defense grid, Robert panted, helping Amelia navigate a steep set of rusted grating. The planetary shields would have vaporized their dropships. He didn't have to, Amelia coughed, spitting a fleck of blood onto the grating. As general of the Vanguard, he has access to the automated defense grid. He must have lowered a localized sector shield, just long enough for a covert Viren insertion team to slip through the atmosphere. It was a decapitation strike. Kill the king, kill the must heir, and hand the command codes over to the enemy. They finally reached the bottom of the shaft, kicking open a heavy vent that spilled them out onto the polished durasteel floor of the royal hangar. The hangar was massive, usually housing dozens of sleek diplomatic frigates. Now, it was eerily empty, save for one ship. Sitting stubbornly in the center of the bay, leaking a small puddle of hydraulic fluid, was the Rusty Nail. "Home sweet home," Harry grinned, wiping sweat and grime from his forehead. "Come on, I've got medical bays on board." "Well, a cot and a lot of duct tape, but it'll keep the princess stable once we break orbit." "We are not leaving," Amelia said, leaning heavily against her father. Harry stopped, staring at her like she had lost her mind. Princess, with all due respect, your planet is currently undergoing a hostile corporate takeover by giant space lizards. We need to leave, regroup, and come back with the coalition fleet. If we leave, Wright uses my father's command console to lower the planetary shields entirely, Amelia said, her eyes flashing with defiance. The Viren Armada is likely waiting in the dark space just outside our system. The moment we jump, New Avalon burns. Billions will die. Before Harry could argue, a slow, mocking applause echoed across the vast hangar. From the shadows of a heavy cargo lifter, General Thomas Wright emerged. He looked pale, a nasty burn mark scorching the side of his neck where Dr. Lewis had shocked him, but he was flanked by a dozen Vern mercenaries, their weapons trained squarely on the small group. Always the brilliant tactician Amelia, Wright rasped, his voice hoarse. Even half dead, you see the board perfectly. Yes, the Vern fleet is waiting. And in exactly 10 minutes, when I broadcast the king's tragic assassination by a rogue scavenger, I will assume emergency powers and lower the grid. You're a traitor, Thomas, King Robert snarled, his grip tightening on his pistol, though he knew he couldn't take down 12 Vern before they were all vaporized. You served beside me for 30 years. You swore an oath to humanity. I am saving humanity, Wright shouted, losing his composure. You are a fool, Robert. We are losing this war. For every Vern ship we destroy, they build 10. For every soldier we train, they clone 100. They offered me a deal. We surrender New Avalon, we disarm the fleet, and they grant us a reservation world in the Outer Rim. We get to survive. Survival on our knees is just a slower death, Amelia spat back, standing tall despite the agony tearing through her chest. Humanity doesn't live in cages, General. We aren't pets. You're idealistic children, Wright sneered, raising his plasma pistol. And your stubbornness ends today. Harry, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, slowly raised his hands in surrender, taking a few steps away from the royal family. Hey man, General, I'm just a contractor. I just wanted to get paid. You want to shoot the royals, that's your politics. Can I just get in my ship and fly away? Wright laughed, a cruel, harsh sound. The scavenger shows his true colors. Fine, get in your garbage scow and leave. I have no use for you. Appreciate it, Harry said, giving a lazy two-finger salute. He walked up the ramp of the rusty nail, disappearing into the dark interior. Harry, Amelia whispered, a profound sense of betrayal washing over her. Even Robert looked stunned. Now, Wright smiled, aiming at the king. Let's end this. Inside the cockpit of the rusty nail, Harry threw himself into the pilot's seat. He wasn't running. He was a human from the fringes. He knew a thing or two about fighting dirty. He didn't power up the repulsor lifts. He didn't prime the navigation computer. Instead, his hands flew across his jury-rigged analog console, manually bypassing the safety regulators on the ship's aft thrusters. He routed the emergency reserve fuel directly into the primary combustion chambers. Hey, Wright! Harry's voice boomed over the ship's external loudspeakers, echoing through the hangar. You know why I fly an analog rust bucket? Wright frowned, looking up at the ship. What? Because you can't hack a manual override, Harry yelled. He slammed his fist down on the primary ignition switch. The rusty nail didn't lift off. Instead, the heavy, unshielded chemical thrusters at the rear of the ship detonated with the force of a controlled volcanic eruption. A massive, roaring pillar of blue-white exhaust plasma shot backward, screaming out at thousands of degrees. General Wright and the Vern shock troops were caught directly in the backwash. The Viren's advanced energy shields, designed for pinpoint energy blasts, were instantly overloaded by the sheer, sustained, overwhelming kinetic force of a starship's raw chemical exhaust. The aliens screeched as their armor melted, blown backward across the hangar bay like ragdolls caught in a hurricane. Wright was thrown 50 feet, his personal shield shattering like glass before he slammed into a Durasteel bulkhead, falling entirely limp. Robert grabbed Amelia, dragging her behind the heavy landing struts of the ship just as the exhaust wave washed over the hangar, melting crates and scorching the walls. Harry abruptly cut the engines. The deafening roar was replaced by the hissing of cooling metal and the groans of the surviving, heavily crippled Vierne soldiers. Harry strolled back down the ramp, tossing a heavy wrench from hand to hand. He looked at the charred remains of the strike team, then at King Robert and Amelia. "Oops," Harry grinned, perfectly masking the adrenaline shaking his hands. Slipped on the clutch. Amelia let out a breathless, exhausted laugh, sliding down the landing strut to sit on the floor. "You insane, brilliant scrapper." King Robert walked over to where General Wright lay unconscious, kicking the traitor's weapon away. He tapped his royal comms unit, syncing it to the palace's emergency broadcast system. "Attention all Vanguard and Royal Guard forces," the king's voice boomed across the entire planet. "This is King Robert Rutherford. General Wright is a traitor. The Vierne have infiltrated the palace. Protocol Omega is rescinded. Initiate Protocol Vengeance. Cleanse our home." Across the palace, the Loyalists, now realizing the truth, turned their fury upon the remaining Verne and the corrupted Vanguard officers. The coup was shattered in an instant. Humanity, pushed to the brink, fought back with the ferocity of a cornered predator. Hours later, as the dawn finally broke over the rain-slicked city of New Avalon, the skies were clear. The automated defense grid remained firmly in place, and the Vierne Armada, realizing their inside man had failed, cowardly retreated back into deep space. Amelia was placed in a proper, functioning stasis bed, surrounded by the best medical technology the Empire had to offer. King Robert stood by her side, a heavy burden lifted from his shoulders, replaced by a renewed, burning resolve. Harry leaned against the doorway of the Royal Medical Suite, his scavenged armor finally stripped away, wearing a clean set of borrowed clothes that didn't quite fit. He held a massive, ridiculous velvet bag filled with high-grade credit chips, his reward from the king. "You don't have to go back to the fringes, Harrison," Amelia said softly, looking at him through the glass. "The Coalition could use a man who knows how to think outside the standard tactical manuals. I could use you." Harry smiled, a genuine warm expression. He tossed the bag of credits into the air and caught it. "I appreciate the offer, Princess. Truly. But I don't look good in a uniform. Plus, there's a whole lot of Vierne wreckage out there by Obsidian Ridge just waiting to be salvaged. Somebody's got to clean up the galaxy." He gave her a two-finger salute this time out of genuine respect. "Keep fighting the good fight, Your Highness, and if you ever need a ride, you know who to call." With that, the scrapper turned and walked down the pristine marble halls, a chaotic, unpredictable spark of humanity heading back out into the dark, ready to remind the universe that humanity was never, ever truly dead. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey through the ash and stars. If Harrison's wild ingenuity and Amelia's unyielding human spirit kept you on the edge of your seat, please smash that like button. Share this story with your fellow sci-fi fans who love a good HFY tale, and don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell for more epic, original sci-fi stories delivered right to your feed. See you in the next adventure.